It was supposed to be just another regular afternoon at the gas station. The sun hung high in the sky, casting sharp shadows across the pavement. People were in and out, filling their tanks, grabbing snacks, or mindlessly scrolling on their phones. But for Maria, a quiet, hard-working woman in her late 40s, this moment was just one more stop on her way home after a long day at work. She drove an old, dented sedan, nothing fancy, just a car that had faithfully served her for years. As she stepped out to refuel, a loud laugh cut through the air. Two young men leaned against a gleaming Bugatti parked nearby. Expensive sunglasses, designer clothes, and the arrogance that came with privilege dripped off them. One of them pointed at Maria's car and said loudly, "Look at that antique. I didn't know dinosaurs still ran on gas." They laughed, mocking her worn-out shoes and faded dress. Passersby chuckled awkwardly or looked away, unsure whether to step in or not. Maria didn't say a word. She simply looked at them, her face unreadable, and continued pumping gas. But inside, something stirred. She wasn't angry, at least, not the kind that yells or curses. No, hers was a different kind of quiet fire. The kind that waited for the right moment. Because what those men didn't know was that Maria had once worn a different kind of uniform, and her old car. Just a convenience, a memory of a life she no longer lived. 1 hour later, at an event downtown, the same young men would get the shock of their lives as the crowd gathered for a military charity demonstration. A roar echoed through the streets. Steel crushed pavement, and the impossible happened. But how did Maria go from a mocked woman at a gas station to the one behind the controls of a tank, aimed right at their million-dollar pride and joy? This was no accident. This was a lesson in respect, and it had only just begun. Maria had always kept a low profile. She lived in a modest apartment on the edge of town, worked 2 jobs, and never complained. People in the neighborhood knew her as the woman who helped elderly neighbors carry groceries, or fixed a child's broken bike without being asked. But none of them knew about her past. Years ago, Maria served in the Army not just as a soldier, but as one of the most skilled armored vehicle operators in her unit. She had driven tanks through desert storms, icy terrain, and even tense rescue missions. But after losing her younger brother in a mission gone wrong, she left that world behind, searching for peace in a quieter life. What she couldn't leave behind, however, was her sense of discipline, control, and quiet strength. So when those boys laughed at her old car, they weren't just mocking a vehicle. They were mocking years of service, sacrifice, and resilience. She didn't want revenge. That wasn't her style, but fate had a funny way of bringing the past back around. Earlier that week, Maria had been invited to a local military charity showcase by a former commander. They needed someone to demonstrate how to operate a vintage battle tank being auctioned for veterans' aid. At first, she hesitated, but finally agreed, thinking it might be a good way to reconnect and support a cause close to her heart. She didn't know that the same 2 young men social media influencers chasing views and clout would show up at the event with cameras, bragging about their luxury cars and mocking the display. Maria quietly climbed into the tank, her hands moving like she'd never left the battlefield. As the engine rumbled to life and the crowd began to gather, all eyes turned to her. But it was what happened next that no one, especially those 2, saw coming, as the tank rolled slowly across the event grounds, its weight pressing heavily into the asphalt. People gathered in awe. Children pointed in excitement. Veterans nodded in respect, and even the organizers seemed surprised by how smoothly Maria handled the massive machine. She wore a calm expression, focused, as if every move of the gear stick and turn of the wheel was part of a familiar rhythm. But then, through the front panel, she spotted them, those same 2 young men from the gas station, laughing again. This time with phones in hand, filming content for their followers. Their Bugattis sat gleaming just beyond the demonstration line, surrounded by a small group of fans. One of the influencers looked directly into the camera and said, "Watch this, we're about to show everyone how real power looks." He strutted toward the tank, throwing exaggerated salutes and fake orders. It was supposed to be a joke, but it didn't land. Some people chuckled nervously. Others looked uncomfortable. Maria didn't react, but her hands gripped the controls a little tighter. Behind her, a younger volunteer named Liam was watching closely. He was part of the charity group, new and eager to help, and he'd heard about Maria's military record. "She's not just anyone," he whispered to a friend. "That woman saved lives. She's a legend." Not that those guys would ever know. The whispers began to spread. Slowly, people in the crowd began to recognize Maria just as a tank operator, but as someone who had earned every bit of their respect. The influencers, however, were too wrapped up in their performance to notice the shift in mood. One even dared to pretend to challenge the tank, stepping directly in front of it with mock bravado. Maria stopped the tank with perfect precision, inches from him. The silence that followed was electric. Everyone held their breath. She opened the hatch and stood up, locking eyes with the crowd, then turned toward the Bugatti. The tension cracked like thunder. Everyone felt it, but no one knew what she would do next. The moment Maria stood up from the tank's hatch, the crowd went silent, completely still, like time itself had paused. Her expression remained calm, unreadable. But her eyes scanned the two young men who only minutes earlier had turned her into the punchline of a joke. The influencer who'd stepped in front of the tank suddenly realized he might have taken things too far. He gave a nervous laugh, hoping to play it off for the camera. "Relax, lady, it's just for content," he said, raising his hands as if that excused everything. But Maria didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence itself was louder than any words. Liam, watching from the sidelines, felt his heart thudding in his chest. He knew what that look in her eyes meant. This wasn't just about a fancy car or internet clout. This was about dignity. About showing people that respect isn't tied to money or status. Suddenly, the crowd shifted. More veterans began stepping forward, standing behind the tank, behind Maria. Some recognized her. One man in a wheelchair murmured her name with reverence. Another, with silver hair and medals pinned to his chest, gave a firm nod. Word began to spread, and phones that had once been raised to film the influencers now turned toward her. The narrative had changed. The Bugatti sparkled under the sun, its mirror-like surface reflecting the tension in the air. It sat directly in the path of the tank's next maneuver. The influencer who owned it looked unsure now, glancing between Maria and the vehicle, torn between his pride and the growing fear that this wasn't going to end like one of his usual prank videos. He stepped back, then forward, as if debating whether to stop the tank or just get out of the way. Maria's hands returned to the controls. The engine growled louder. The tank inched forward, deliberate and steady. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Dust lifted, hearts raced, and the distance between steel and luxury narrowed with every second. The ground trembled. Then, just before the moment everything could change, Maria's foot hovered over the brake. And then she looked straight at the Bugatti. Just as Maria's eyes locked onto the Bugatti, and the tank crept closer. A loud shout pierced through the tension. "Stop! That's government property." A man in a dark suit came rushing through the crowd, flashing a badge. He was with the city's public safety office, and not because of the tank, but because of the influencers themselves. Apparently, this wasn't the first time these two had disrupted a public event for the sake of a viral video. Earlier that week, they'd been warned after pulling a reckless stunt near a hospital entrance, nearly causing an accident. This time, someone had tipped off the city, and officers had been keeping an eye on their location. The crowd turned toward The official, unsure of whether this was another twist or part of the show. Maria paused, hands still on the controls, eyes narrowed. The man approached her and lowered his voice. "Ma'am, I know what you're doing, and I respect it. If you go 1 inch further, they'll flip the story and make you the villain. They're filming everything." That changed the air again. The influencers were smirking, sensing they might get away with it. One of them whispered to the other, "She can't do anything now. We got it all on video. She touches it, she's finished." Their confidence returned like a wave, and they turned back to the cameras, playing innocent. "We love veterans. It was all a misunderstanding," they announced loudly, putting on fake smiles. But Liam wasn't buying it. He quietly pulled out his phone and opened a live stream, pointing the camera not at the tank or the car but at the crowd. The veterans, the people now whispering about who Maria really was. Thousands began watching, seeing the truth from a different lens. This wasn't about a car, it was about character. Maria looked down at the tank controls again, this time not in anger but in careful thought. She didn't move the tank forward or back. Instead, she switched it into idle, climbed out slowly, and stepped down. The influencers exhaled in relief, thinking they'd won. But they hadn't noticed what she was walking toward, and neither had the crowd. Maria walked past the Bugatti with a